Hello everyone, my name is David Connolly and this video is designed to give you a very quick overview of the heat and cold demands that occur in buildings both today and in the future, especially in a European context. This video builds on a previous slideshow I gave, but this time I'm going to focus in explicitly on buildings and I'm going to talk purely about the heat and cold demands. The first thing I want to show you, which can often surprise people, is what the situation is today. Because if we look at the situation for all of Europe right now, what we find is that the heat demand is actually almost 20 times bigger than the cooling demand. This graph here illustrates the heat and cold demands in buildings in Europe, all 28 member states for the year 2010. And what you can see is that the heat demand, as I said, is almost 20 times bigger than the cooling demand. The reason for this is that many people imagine that the heat and cooling demand is distributed in a very different way than to what it actually is. If you look on the left hand side, this is typically what people imagine when we talk about the distribution of the heating and cooling demands. So they expect that in the north of Europe it's very cold and as a result we need a lot of heating, while in the south of Europe it's very warm and therefore we need a lot of cooling. But in Heat Roadmap Europe we developed the first ever pan-European thermal atlas, which actually maps the heating and cooling demands on a 1 kilometer squared resolution. And what we found was that the demands are much more closely linked to the urban infrastructure that we have and where people are located in cities and towns and so on, rather than being closely linked to actual latitude or the north or south proximity that you are in Europe. This is also reflected in another study that was carried out by one of the Heat Roadmap Europe partners, Helmstedt University, via Professor Sven Werner, who created the European Heating Index. And what this graph shows you is, on a more, let's say, aggregated level, that the average heat demand in Europe, which is illustrated here by 100%, actually cuts across Britain and Ireland, goes down through Central Europe and heads towards the southeast. So therefore, this illustrates where the heat demands in Europe are relatively similar and are at an average level. If we go 20% above the average and 20% below the average, we go all the way from Madrid to Stockholm. This just illustrates how the heat demand in buildings today is actually relatively similar from north to south of Europe. The cooling demand is also quite similar, but a much more extreme variation than the heat demand. So in other words, if we look at the average cooling demand, you can see the 100% line here as I travel from through Spain and Portugal, once again up through Central Europe and then towards the east. And as you can see, the cooling demand varies by plus or minus 40% in comparison to the heat demand that covered the majority of Europe with a plus or minus 20% range. So this just shows you how the need for heating across Europe is much more similar than the need for cooling. In other words, towards the more northern parts of Europe, there's practically no need for cooling, whereas even in the most southern parts of Europe, there is a need for quite a lot of heating. Now, when you put this all together and you look at the breakdown between heating and cooling across the different member states, you can see how these numbers illustrate a very high heat demand for all member states. So, for example, you can see for the majority of member states, heat actually represents 90% or more of the total if you add up heating and cooling demands together. There's only a few member states where there's a deviation. So, for example, Cyprus, Greece, Malta and Spain have cooling demands that maybe represent around 20% or more of the total, but for the other member states it's typically 20% or less. Again, this is just looking at heating and cooling demands in isolation and the breakdown between them. It also demonstrates once again, like I highlighted with the maps, how the need for heating is pretty similar all across Europe, whether or not you're in a north or southern country. Another really interesting point that is often worth highlighting is that the cooling demand is usually very high in cities and not very high anywhere else. One of the really simple ways to demonstrate this is if we look at the biggest district cooling systems in Europe, you can see that a lot of them are actually in northern European member states. So the likes of Helsinki, Stockholm and Paris have some of the biggest district cooling networks all over Europe, and yet they're in the very northern part of Europe. And that's because the cooling demand is very concentrated in cities because it's primarily required for the services sector in places like hotels and office buildings, which means it's not so connected to the temperature you have outside. but it's more connected to the amount of buildings you have clustered together in very tight spaces within our cities. So in other words, even in cold times in the winter, a lot of these buildings still need a cooling demand because the people inside the buildings are actually overheating the buildings sometimes, even though the temperature outside might be relatively cold. If we then move away from today's situation and talk more about the future, there's two very important trends that we need to consider. The first is that the heat demand is likely to decrease, and the reason for that is that we're actually improving our building stock all the time. We're installing more insulation in our walls and roofs, we're improving our windows, and we're improving our doors by upgrading them to more efficient versions. This means that looking at the heat demand today and projecting it to the future, it means that we're likely to reduce these demands going forward rather than increase them. In contrast, our cooling demand is likely to increase. Now, this is something that was very interesting that we found in Heat Roadmap Europe 3, but the primary reason that the cooling demand is so low is because so many people decide that they won't bother installing a cooling device because they'll simply live with the discomfort of having an overheated building because it only happens for a few weeks or months during the year. In other words, if there's only a few weeks or a month or two in the summer where your building is overheated, it's not worth the money to go and install a cooling device, and instead you'll just open a window and hope that you can cool the building as much as you can and live with the overheating, the internal part of the building for the few short months that you have. However, as people get more demands on a higher comfort of living, it's likely that people will install more and more cooling devices in the future because a lot of people don't have them. Just to give you one number to demonstrate that, we expect that right now in Europe only around 15% of the cooling demand we ideally need is actually being met. In other words, there's a lot of residential buildings especially that don't install a cooling device where in fact they could actually need one. So we don't really know how this is going to evolve in the future just yet, but if I just made a scenario, and I want to highlight that this is just one scenario where we implement heat savings and we increase our level of cooling. And I've done a really extreme scenario here where I've implemented the maximum amount of heat savings that we can imagine happening between now and the year 2050, which is a 50% reduction in our heat demand. At the same time, I've increased our cooling demands significantly from, as I mentioned, about 15% of our cooling demand is currently met today, and assume that that's increased almost over three times to assuming that 50% of our cooling demand is met in the future. And doing these two extreme changes means that in the future the mix would change dramatically, where heating would become a much lower share of the total demands than cooling. And this is just to point out that if demands evolve in this way in the future, then cooling could become a much more significant part of our energy mix in the future, while heating could become a lower part of it. However, today the focus should be very much on heating because that represents the majority of our demands, whereas cooling is something that's likely to grow rather than something that we have to deal with at present. In just again to emphasize, this is all very uncertain. So in Heat Roadmap Europe 4, we have a lot of work being carried out by some of our partners to try and improve the understanding of this evolution, and even link it not only to human behavior and changes in our habits, but also link it to changes we can expect with climate change. So please keep an eye on the project if you want to learn more about that. The other output I just want to highlight from Heat Roadmap Europe is the Pan-European Thermal Atlas. And as I mentioned, this was the first attempt to model the heating and cooling demand on a 1 kilometer squared resolution. In Heat Roadmap Europe 3, we did that in a very detailed way for 5 individual member states, where you can actually go to our website heatroadmap.eu and extract data from these online interactive heat atlases about individual towns and cities in these particular countries. So please check out the website if you actually want to get your hands on some detailed data in those particular countries. But I also want to highlight that even though we don't have it in as much detail, we do also have a European heat atlas where you can at least view the heat demand. You can't extract data because it's not as sophisticated as the other ones, but you can actually look at the distribution of heat within individual cities. And here I've just taken extracts of the heat demands from London, Copenhagen, Rome and Bucharest as examples. And again, that's on our website if you want to see it in more detail. I just want to highlight as well, just as a caveat, that the heat demands that we have mapped in Heat Roadmap Europe 3 are today's heat demands, while the cooling demands we mapped in Heat Roadmap Europe 3 were the future cooling demands if we needed all of our cooling demands in the future, so the max cooling demand we could need in the future. And that's because we haven't got enough data yet to map what is today's cooling demand, so we have distributed what would be the maximum if everybody actually met their cooling demands, rather than trying to predict who is doing it right now and so on. So that's just an important difference. The heat mapping in Peta 3 is today's heat demand, while the cooling demand in Peta 3 is not today's cooling demand. It's what the future cooling demand would be if all of the service sector industry actually met its cooling demand. You can check out more on our website, and also just to inform you that in Heat Roadmap 4 right now, we're expanding our work to include 14 countries in more detail. As I mentioned, we're trying to improve our understanding of the demands. We're improving the mapping. And one also important upgrade is that Utrecht University, another partner who's been added to the Heat Roadmap Europe team, is also adding industry to a lot of our calculations. So that's something to look forward to in the Heat Roadmap Europe 4 work. And as always, the whole purpose of all of this will be to develop 14 low carbon heating and cooling strategies for each of the member states included in Heat Roadmap Europe 4. So to conclude with my so what points, the first thing is that the short-term focus should very much be on decarbonising heating, even in the southern European countries which are perceived to be the hot countries. The other thing is that cooling demands may be high in individual cities because the cooling demand is very concentrated in the city areas, but at a national level it's a very small amount. And finally then, the cooling demand may become more significant in the future as cooling increases and heating decreases. However, at the moment this is extremely uncertain, but we hope to improve our understanding in Heat Roadmap Europe 4. Thank you very much for listening to the video. I hope you got some useful information about the heating and cooling demands in buildings, and please follow our website heatroadmap.eu, or follow us on Twitter, or subscribe to our YouTube channel if you want to keep updated in the future. Thanks for listening.